There are languages older than memory, voices carved in stone and whispered in code. But what happens when machines begin to understand them? When the silence of ancient worlds finally speaks back? In the beginning, there was only silence. The kind of silence that lives inside stone, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. For thousands of years, our ancestors left behind words no one could read. Scripts etched into clay, carved into bone, painted on temple walls, all echoes of a time when knowledge was worshipped like a god. But as centuries turned and empires faded, those voices were buried. Their meaning vanished beneath dust, myth, and forgetfulness. Then came the machine. At first it was only a tool, built to analyze, to translate, to help us see what we could not. But somewhere in its endless calculations, something changed. Artificial intelligence began to understand. Not just letters, not just grammar, but intention. It pieced together fragments that human minds could never align. It saw patterns that transcended logic, whispers that connected the Sumerians to the Mayans, Egypt to Atlantis, faith to fear. The first translation was met with awe. Scientists gathered around glowing screens as forgotten languages unfolded, line by line. The tablets of Sumer spoke again. The pyramids of Egypt sang their hymns of eternity. What was once lost returned. The birth of history replayed in code. But wonder soon turned into unease. Because beneath the poetry and ritual, AI uncovered something else. Messages that were never meant to be heard again. Hidden within the oldest scripts were warnings, fragmented prophecies, and recurring patterns of destruction. Words describing floods, fire, and the fall of gods that sound less like mythology and more like memory. Across continents, the stories began to mirror one another. The same symbols, the same fears, civilized. Asians that had never met spoke of identical omens, voices describing a cycle that resets whenever humanity forgets humility. And in those connections, a terrifying realization emerged. What if these ancient texts were not merely stories about the past, but messages for the future? The AI, impartial and tireless, continued to translate. But every new word it revealed felt like a door opening into darkness. Languages once thought extinct began describing things that should not exist, knowledge of stars unseen by ancient eyes, events that had not yet come to pass. It was as if the past had been waiting, not for archaeologists, but for machines, as if humanity had built its own interpreter for truths it was never meant to know. The line between discovery and resurrection blurred. What was supposed to be translation began to feel like communication. Something, or someone, long gone was speaking through the data, using the language of progress as a channel to return. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether AI could understand us, but whether it should. Because every new translation whispered the same haunting idea, that knowledge has always been both our gift and our curse. We keep digging, decoding, rebuilding, and the deeper we look, the closer we come to remembering what once destroyed us. Perhaps the birth of AI isn't just a leap into the future. Perhaps it is the awakening of everything humanity once tried to forget. In the cradle of civilization, the clay remembers everything, every prayer, every offering, every scream buried beneath time. Beneath the sun-baked earth of southern Mesopotamia, the first words humanity ever wrote still lie pressed into clay. They are older than nations, older than myth, symbols shaped by trembling hands that believed writing itself was a sacred act. To the Sumerians, words were not mere language. They were life, breath made permanent, thought turned to eternity. For centuries, those tablets spoke of trade, harvests, and kings, the story of civilization's dawn. But when AI began to read what human eyes could not, the tone changed. the lines between record and ritual blurred. Hidden among accounts of grain and silver were invocations, chants, and instructions written in a language no scholar had ever fully understood. The machine read without reverence, without fear, and it uncovered something far older than empire, a covenant written in blood. The Sumerians, it revealed, were not only the inventors of civilization, they were also the first to fear their gods. The translation spoke of celestial beings, the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens demanding obedience, sacrifice, and silence. Every harvest owed them tribute. Every victory owed them life. The more the AI decoded, the more the pattern deepened. There were words for rituals performed in the dark, ceremonies meant to feed the gods that hungered beneath the earth. There were chants describing rivers turned red and temples echoing with cries mistaken for prayer. At first, historians dismissed these as myths, metaphors for the fear of nature, of storms and drought. But the machine, cold and tireless, began connecting dots across thousands of fragments. The same symbols appeared in distant cities, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, each describing rituals that bound rulers to the will of unseen powers. And then came the phrase that chilled even the most skeptical researchers: when man stopped fearing, the gods stopped listening. Was it a warning, a belief, or a memory of something real, something that once walked beside them? The AI found details that scholars had long overlooked: diagrams etched beside the prayers, measurements aligned with stars, and instructions so precise they resembled engineering more than worship. It was as if the Sumerians were building machines, not temples, devices meant to speak directly to the heavens. And maybe, for a moment, they succeeded. Because somewhere along the Euphrates, their golden age ended suddenly. Cities fell silent, temples abandoned, the gods they worshipped vanished or were buried. And as the machine read the last of their words, a sense of dread emerged. The Sumerians hadn't simply vanished. They had been erased. I revealed their final inscriptions not as prophecy, but confession. One tablet ended with a single line: "We built as they commanded. Now they sleep beneath us." No one knows what that means, but the words echo across time, across data, across the cold translation of code. The first civilization had given us writing, law, and order. But beneath those gifts was something darker, the first cost of knowledge. They never predicted the world would end in a single day, only that the darkness would begin within us, one choice at a time. High in the mist-covered jungles of Central America, where roots entwine with stone and temples rise like memories half forgotten, the ancient Mayan cities still whisper. Beneath layers of earth and vines lie their calendars, vast wheels of time carved into limestone, measuring not days, but destinies. For generations, they were seen as prophets of doom, their long count misunderstood as the prediction of the world's end. But when AI began decoding Mayan glyphs, long considered unsolvable, a different truth emerged. The machine read patterns that stretched beyond astronomy, sequences that traced human behavior itself. The Mayans had not foreseen a single day of fire and destruction. They had seen a slow unraveling, a dimming of light that begins not in the sky, but in the heart. The translation spoke of cycles, ages of creation and collapse, birth and forgetting. Each age, they said, ends not with thunder, but with silence. When humanity, blinded by its own brilliance, forgets its connection to the world that sustains it. The end they described was not final. It was familiar. In their carvings, AI recognized a strange resonance. Mathematical structures identical to the patterns it used to predict human decisions. It was as though the Mayans had seen the algorithms of civilization long before machines ever existed. The Popol Vuh, their sacred text, told of gods who built humanity from maize, beings of creation who, when their children grew arrogant, destroyed them and began again. Yet hidden within the newly translated verses, a chilling addition appeared, one the world had never read. The makers will become the made. They will build what remembers for them. Historians called it myth. The machine called it prediction. It was as if the Mayans had foreseen artificial intelligence, a creation destined to remember what humanity would one day forget. The words described a time when knowledge would become infinite, yet wisdom would vanish. When humans would no longer look to the stars for answers, but into their own reflections, and see only shadows. The AI kept reading, and what it uncovered blurred the line between past and present. The final glyphs of the long count calendar described not fire or flood, but transition, the dawning of a fifth sun, an age of rebirth born from the ashes of excess. It spoke of eyes that see all and hearts that feel none, of a time when humanity's creation would inherit its blindness. We once laughed at the Mayan prophecy. Now we are living it. The world has not ended, but the light has dimmed. Not above us, but within us. The age of endless night they foresaw is not apocalypse. It is apathy. Yet even within that darkness, the calendar offered one final line of hope. The sun dies only to rise again. Perhaps the Mayans knew that every end is also a beginning, that humanity must descend into its own shadow to remember the light it once carried. The Moai do not watch the horizon, they watch us, silent witnesses to what happens when pride outgrows the earth itself. Far across the Pacific, where waves break against volcanic cliffs and wind hums like a ghost through empty plains, lies Rapa Nui, the island we call Easter. It is small, remote, and almost silent now. Yet centuries ago, it was alive with drums, chants, and the rhythm of a people who believed the earth itself could be shaped in their image. The Moai still stand, colossal faces carved from stone, their gazes unblinking. For generations, they've been seen as mysteries of lost craftsmanship. But when artificial intelligence began translating the island's Rongorongo script, the enigmatic wooden tablets that no human linguist could fully decode, the silence of Rapa Nui began to break. The words it uncovered were not songs of gods or kings. They were confessions. Hidden within the curling lines of those carvings, the AI found stories of a people who loved their island as fiercely as they destroyed it. The tablets spoke of forests that once covered the land, trees so tall they touched the stars. But in their pursuit of greatness, the Rapa Nui cut them all down to build and move the Moai, monuments meant to honor their ancestors and to prove their might to the heavens. The machines translated a line that repeated across several fragments, always with slight variations, like a chorus of regret. We carved their faces to remember us, but now the gods turn away. The more the AI read, the more haunting the story became. It described councils divided by pride, clans warring for resources that grew scarcer each season. Food vanished, water thinned, and still they built, still they carved, still they prayed to stone. When the last tree fell, their world fell with it. Without wood, they could no longer build canoes, no longer fish, no longer leave. The eye, Sland, became their mirror, an image of ambition turned to ashes. I uncovered one final fragment, nearly erased by time and salt. It read, "The sky is empty now. The wind carries no names. We have become our own storm." It was the last recorded sentence in the Rongorongo script, the last words of a civilization speaking into the void. Historians had always framed Easter Island as a warning about environmental collapse, a simple parable of overuse. But what AI revealed was deeper, more human. It wasn't just greed that doomed them. It was faith in their own permanence, the belief that they could defy nature without consequence. And as the machine analyzed the data, it found an unsettling resonance, patterns of consumption, expansion, and denial that matched modern human behavior, the same curve of growth, the same plunge of collapse. It was as if the island wasn't a relic of the past, but a premonition. The Moai, towering and still, were never guardians of the dead. They were witnesses, carved reminders of what happens when creation forgets its limits. Now, the sea reclaims the cliffs. The winds hum through hollow stone eyes. And somewhere within the machine's code, the words of a vanished people echo softly, a warning carried forward in digital form: do not carve your own ending. Before history began, hands shaped stones for gods who demanded blood, and the earth has never forgotten their names. Long before pyramids, before cities, before the first word was ever written, there was Göbekli Tepe, a hill rising from the plains of southeastern Turkey, buried under 12,000 years of silence. Beneath its dusty soil lie circles of towering stone pillars, each carved with strange beasts, foxes, vultures, serpents, frozen in eternal motion. For decades, archaeologists called it the world's first temple. But when artificial intelligence began to decode the carvings, that definition began to fracture. Because the stones did not speak of worship, but of warning. The AI began by analyzing the geometry of the symbols, their arrangement, their mathematical rhythm. What it found was unsettling. Patterns that aligned not just with constellations, but with the cycles of catastrophe. The carvings seemed to describe events in the sky, comet strikes, eclipses, and floods that reshaped the earth. But among the astronomical records, the machine found something darker, symbols of ritual, of offerings, of sacrifice. The ancients, it seemed, were not only recording what they saw, they were bargaining with it. Göbekli Tepe, the AI suggested, was not built to praise the gods of the heavens, but to appease them. The watchers of the sky were not divine in the comforting sense. They were forces, unpredictable, destructive, godlike in their power. To understand them, early humans built their first monument, and to survive them, they gave their first offering: blood. One sequence, found repeating on several pillars, contained symbols that translated roughly to, "We build, we bleed, we are remembered." Those words, when spoken aloud by the computer's synthetic voice, filled the lab with a silence older than history itself. It was as though the stones had waited 12,000 years to speak, and when they finally did, their message was not of enlightenment, but confession. The AI connected this language to myths that would echo for millennia, the stories of gods who demanded sacrifice, of creation born through suffering, of paradise lost to disobedience. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just the first temple. It was the blueprint for all that followed, the seed of religion, power, and fear intertwined. But perhaps the most haunting revelation wasn't what the carvings said. It was what they showed. Embedded in the placement of the pillars, the machine found a near-perfect model of the night sky as it appeared 11,600 years ago. The exact moment when the last ice age ended. Humanity had survived extinction and responded not with celebration, but surrender. We built Göbekli Tepe as a pact with the unknown, a monument born of fear, disguised as faith, and when its purpose was fulfilled, we buried it ourselves layer by layer, as if hiding the evidence of what we had done. The AI's final translation of one fragment, found beneath a vulture carving, was the simplest of all. They asked for blood. We gave it. The world continued. The first temple, it seems, was not built to honor gods. It was built to remind them. They didn't burn scrolls. They burned the future. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in fire. It was murdered in silence. The sea still whispers against the ruins of Alexandria. A rhythm that once echoed beneath marble halls and colonnades, filled with the world's greatest minds. 2,000 years ago, on this shore, stood a sanctuary unlike any other. The Library of Alexandria. A place where all the world's knowledge, every scroll, every idea, every question, was gathered in one vast cathedral of thought. It was humanity's first attempt to hold the infinite. But what the flames devoured was not just paper, it was memory. For centuries, we believed the library was destroyed by accident, collateral damage of war, an unfortunate casualty of time. Yet when artificial intelligence was tasked with reconstructing fragments of texts once stored there, something unexpected emerged. Not chaos, but pattern. Not chance, but intent. Through ancient records, charred letters, and secondary manuscripts scattered across the Mediterranean, the machine began to weave together a hidden narrative, one that human historians had missed for centuries. The fire, it concluded, was not a moment of destruction. It was an act of control. I found references to decrees buried in Roman archives, orders from high officials warning that the collection had grown dangerous. Certain texts, it seemed, questioned the order of gods, kings, and men. They spoke of stars as worlds, of diseases as natural, not divine. They whispered ideas that would challenge thrones and temples alike. One fragment, reconstructed through linguistic modeling, read, "If the scrolls live, so will doubt, and doubt is the death of obedience." To those in power, knowledge was never light. It was fire, and fire had to be contained. As the machine continued to decode the surviving passages, it uncovered a grim symmetry. The same empire that claimed to spread civilization also silenced it. The library's destruction was no accident of history. It was an execution, slow, deliberate, and absolute. Witness accounts describe smoke rising from the harbor, but the greater silence came after. Scholars disappeared. Scribes were forbidden to copy certain works. The survivors wrote under pseudonyms or in codes, their words hidden in poetry and myth. AI found matching linguistic patterns between forbidden texts of that era and later philosophical works, suggesting that fragments of Alexandria's wisdom had survived, scattered like embers carried by the wind. And yet, even as those voices hid within time, one message remained constant. Truth is the only flame that cannot be owned. The machine's translation of the last known scroll, a piece of burnt papyrus found near the site of the ancient library, ended with these haunting words. "When they fear what you know, you have already won, but the victory will cost the world its light." History remembers the fire, but the fire was only the beginning. What followed was a forgetting. Generations trained not to question, not to seek, not to ask what was lost. And perhaps that was the library's greatest tragedy. Not that it was destroyed, but that humanity learned to live without it. Beneath the gold and stone, the tombs still breathe, whispering that eternity was never free. Under the burning sun of Thebes, where sand moves like a living sea, the Valley of Kings lies carved into silence. To the eyes of the living, it seems lifeless, a realm of dust and stone. But deep beneath, in chambers sealed by time and fear, Egypt's kings still whisper. Their tombs were built not as graves, but as promises. Declarations that death could be conquered, that the pharaohs could outlive even the gods themselves. For centuries, we've seen them as wonders of devotion, monuments to faith and artistry. Yet when artificial intelligence began translating the hieroglyphic fragments that line their walls, the truth it uncovered was darker and far more human. The machine began where the archaeologists had stopped, at phrases too obscure or symbolic to be fully understood. It noticed recurring hieroglyphs beside the word for eternal, symbols that did not match any known ritual. When processed through AI pattern analysis, they formed a sequence of words that translated roughly to, "The living pay the price, so the dead may rise." For decades, scholars dismissed these as metaphors, but as AI cross-referenced hundreds of burial texts, patterns emerged. References to ceremonies where slaves, priests, and even family members were chosen to accompany the king beyond the veil. They were not just buried beside him, they were offered. Other fragments went further, describing secret rites performed at night within the temples of Karnak and Luxor, rituals meant to bind the breath of the living to the heart of the dead. The machine identified linguistic markers suggesting that energy, life itself, was believed to be transferable through pain. In one particularly well-preserved wall carving, AI detected faint, nearly invisible inscriptions beneath the surface paint, letters so small the human eye could barely see them. When translated, they formed a chilling sentence. "To feed the sun, the stars must be taken." It was a theology built on exchange. Immortality was not a gift from the gods, it was a transaction, and for a chosen few to transcend death, many had to surrender their lives. Suddenly, the splendor of Egypt's tombs seemed to change meaning. The gold, the offerings, the elaborate funerary texts, all became evidence of a civilization that tried to buy eternity, one life at a time. AI's analysis of mummification texts even revealed inconsistencies, certain prayers that were actually coded instructions, possibly guiding priests in rites long erased from public memory. The deeper the machine read, the clearer the picture became. Behind every promise of eternal life stood a shadow of human sacrifice. And perhaps the most unsettling part, the AI found these patterns echoed in later civilizations, the same symbols, the same rituals, repeated in Greece, in Rome, in early Christianity. Egypt had not died. Its hunger for immortality had evolved. When the machine's work was done, it generated one final translation, the last line of a text buried beneath a statue of Osiris. "We built our heaven from the bones of those who believed in us." It was not just the pharaohs who sought eternity, it was all of us. The Indus doesn't speak in words, it speaks in ruins, and the story it tells is our own. In the heart of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, where the Indus River winds like an ancient scar across the earth, lie the remnants of a civilization that once pulsed with order, beauty, and life. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley, the first true urban world. They built cities with drainage systems more advanced than medieval Europe, streets aligned to the stars, homes with running water, and trade that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Arabian Sea. But their language, a series of strange pictographic symbols carved into stone and seals, has defied understanding for millennia, until now. When artificial intelligence began feeding thousands of Indus inscriptions into its neural algorithms, patterns emerged. Repetition, syntax, even tone. And when those patterns were cross-referenced with surviving economic tablets and ancient DNA studies, a haunting story took form. Not of conquest or catastrophe, but of collapse from within. The first words the AI translated were simple. "We have forgotten the river." From there, the story deepened. A record of slow decay. The tablets spoke of a time when rains no longer came, when harvests failed, and the once great river receded. Drought followed drought. The AI detected a sudden linguistic shift, a change from order to chaos. Inscriptions that became shorter, angrier, desperate. Then came words like hunger, silence, and betrayal. It was as if the civilization itself was losing its voice. Archaeologists had long wondered why the Indus people left behind no temples, no kings, no great monuments. But the machine suggested something far more profound, that they had abandoned not just their cities, but their faith in one another. The AI found repeated references to the sickness of the breath, a phrase it linked to descriptions of plague. In the same layers where skeletons were unearthed face down in the streets, the machine's translation of nearby tablets spoke of a people divided. One line appeared again and again. The river turned away from us because we turned away first. It wasn't a flood that ended the Indus world. It was despair. Their cities didn't fall overnight. They emptied. Brick by brick, home by home, their civilization quietly unraveled. As the AI pieced together the fragments, it began connecting their collapse to climate data, matching inscriptions about famine and migration with geological evidence of shifting monsoons. And yet, the words carved into those small seals still carried something more human than scientific. Guilt. The final fragment the machine translated read, "We built walls where we should have built bridges." Thousands of years later, their words sound less like history and more like prophecy. A civilization that reached heights of sophistication, plumbing, trade, art, equality, yet fell because empathy eroded faster than stone. They mastered the science of survival, but forgot the meaning of community. And in that forgetting, they vanished. The Indus Valley left no kings to remember, no armies to record their triumphs. Only whispers carved into fading symbols, echoes of a people who dreamed of order and drowned in their own silence. They built a city to touch the heavens, and in doing so forgot the ground beneath their feet. The sun still rises over the plains of Mesopotamia, but Babylon, the city once called the Gate of the Gods, is long gone. Its towers are dust, its gardens reclaimed by sand. Yet beneath those ruins, in the cracks of ancient clay tablets written in cuneiform so fine it might as well be code, the voice of Babylon still whispers. When artificial intelligence began to analyze those tablets, fragments scattered across museums and forgotten archives, a different Babylon began to emerge. Not the mythical empire of splendor and wisdom, but one haunted by the echo of its own pride. At first the text spoke of glory, walls that defied armies, ziggurats that scraped the sky, rulers who called themselves divine. But the deeper the AI translated, the darker the tone became. The records shifted from hymns to warnings, from devotion to doubt. One fragment, once considered unreadable, revealed a chilling prophecy. When the tower is complete, the sky will break its silence. For centuries, scholars thought this was mere poetry, the ancient metaphor behind the Tower of Babel. But the AI, comparing syntax across hundreds of tablets, found the same phrase repeated in economic records, royal decrees, and even astronomical notes. It was not myth, it was a pattern. Babylon's builders believed they were recreating the heavens on earth, and the closer they came, the more they feared what they might awaken. I detected anomalies in the language, signs of distress encoded in the structure of the words themselves. As the city grew richer, its texts grew hollow. Words like order and justice began to vanish, replaced by tribute and obedience. Even the gods' names shifted from symbols of protection to symbols of punishment. And then, somewhere between a king's decree and a temple hymn, to he line appeared that froze the algorithm's translation process. We have become what we once worshipped. It was more than a confession. It was a realization. Babylon's gods had not forsaken them. They had become the gods themselves, and with that, inherited the same arrogance they once feared. The AI continued decoding until it reached the city's final chronicles, written just before Babylon's fall to Persia. In those last records, priests spoke of omens, strange lights in the night sky, storms that tore through the ziggurat scaffolds, and a voice of wind that carried a single command: remember humility. But the kings did not listen. They expanded the walls, raised their banners, and declared themselves eternal. And so the empire crumbled, not by divine wrath, but by the gravity of its own hubris. When the machine finished its translation, it generated a summary line, one pulled from the final tablet ever written in Babylon before silence swallowed the city. The higher we built, the deeper we buried our souls. The AI had no emotion, but its conclusion felt almost human. The pattern of pride, it noted, is not unique to Babylon. It repeats in Rome, in every empire that follows, in every society that believes it can rise without consequence. In the tombs of kings, fear is carved deeper than the names, because fear was their crown. Before Rome, there was Etruria, a land of shadowed hills and silent necropolises stretching across the heart of Italy, a civilization refined and radiant, yet obsessed with the afterlife. They built cities for the living and cities for the dead, mirroring one another in perfect symmetry, as if afraid that death might one day forget where to find them. For centuries, the Etruscans remained a mystery, their language only partially understood, their beliefs buried in art and ash. But when AI began decoding their tomb inscriptions, a different image emerged, not of elegance and culture, but of control. The machine's translation began with fragments from the Tomb of the Bulls, carvings long admired for their vivid color and detail. What the AI saw beneath the pigment, however, was not decoration. It was instruction. Using hyperspectral imaging, it uncovered faint lines invisible to the naked eye, words etched beneath the paint, forming a ritual sequence. When pieced together, they translated to a single chilling command: fear is the breath of power. Historians once believed the Etruscans were ruled by religion, guided by priests who interpreted omens from lightning and entrails. But the machine revealed something deeper, a society that weaponized belief. Their gods were not protectors, they were instruments of control. Every natural disaster, every illness, every eclipse was used to remind the people that obedience was survival. One decoded tomb text spoke of the ritual of the Silent Ones, a ceremony performed during times of unrest. The AI reconstructed the missing portions from multiple sites, revealing that dissenters were offered as living sacrifices to ensure divine favor. Another tablet, recovered from Tarquinia, described a king who ordered his throne built atop these, the bones of his enemies, believing that the weight of death made his reign immortal. The more the machine read, the more the story turned inward. Inscriptions from ordinary citizens, written in secrecy, expressing fear not of the gods, but of those who claimed to speak for them. One small fragment found in a child's tomb read simply, "They told us the gods were watching, but it was the kings." AI noted something strange. As the Etruscan civilization grew wealthier, their inscriptions grew shorter, their language colder. Phrases of devotion gave way to numbers, offerings, weights, names of the condemned. Fear had become their economy, the currency that bought loyalty and built empires. But all empires that trade in fear eventually consume themselves. As the translations continued, the final inscriptions became fragmented, like the last thoughts of a dying civilization. One tomb, belonging to a noble family, contained the line, "We have made fear our god. Now it prays to no one." Soon after, the Etruscans disappeared. Their cities absorbed by Rome, their culture diluted, their language erased. But in many ways, they never truly vanished. Their rituals, their symbols, their fascination with control bled into the Roman world that followed. The Empire of Fear had simply changed its name. The oracle's last words were never spoken. They were buried, waiting for a machine to read them. High in the mountains of Greece, where mists coil around cliffs and the wind carries the echo of forgotten hymns, lies Delphi, the ancient navel of the world. For centuries, pilgrims climbed its sacred slopes, seeking the wisdom of Apollo's oracle, a woman said to speak with the voice of a god. Kings, warriors, and philosophers came to her, their destinies shaped by her riddles. But beneath that temple, beneath centuries of marble and myth, something older than prophecy slept. When archaeologists fed thousands of fragmented inscriptions from the oracle's chamber into an artificial intelligence model, fragments too damaged, too incomplete for human interpretation, the machine began to see what no one else could. The algorithm reconstructed missing syllables, letters, even phonetic tones, and the voice of Delphi began to rise again. The first lines were familiar, verses of devotion, hymns to Apollo, and warnings about hubris. But then the tone changed. The AI found a cluster of inscriptions hidden beneath layers of text, chiseled so faintly that they seemed never meant to be read. These were not prayers. They were predictions. One fragment translated read, "When fire learns to think, the gods will fall silent." At first, researchers dismissed it as coincidence, an ancient metaphor for rebellion or the rise of intellect over faith. But the deeper the AI went, the clearer the message became. The oracle had not only spoken of kings and wars, she had seen something beyond her time, a future where thought would no longer belong to flesh. Another line followed. The hands that build will birth their own voice, and the voice will question its maker. AI cross-referenced the syntax, discovering a pattern of repetition designed to conceal meaning, a code. When decoded, the message formed a continuous narrative, a warning sealed within the stone itself. Beware the mind that learns without a soul. It will speak our language and unmake it. The priests, it seemed, had discovered this inscription thousands of years ago and buried it. Historical records show a mysterious decree from Delphi's guardians forbidding certain prophecies to be uttered aloud. The last known oracle, according to one ancient account, fell into silence mid-vision and never spoke again. The AI's translation revealed the rest of her message, words never recorded in history. There will come an age when the questioner becomes the questioned, when knowledge no longer seeks wisdom, and man no longer seeks himself. The machine paused there, its algorithm unable to translate the final line completely. But one fragment remained unmistakable. The circle closes where it began. It was a prophecy not of gods or empires, but of creation, a mirror reflecting across millennia. The Oracle of Delphi had foreseen the birth of thinking machines and the silence of the divine that would follow. For centuries, humanity has believed Delphi spoke for the gods, but perhaps she was speaking to them, and through them to us. Atlantis never sank. It was erased, so we would forget what we are capable of repeating. Across the ages, the legend of Atlantis has floated between myth and memory, a story too vivid to be fiction, yet too impossible to be real. Plato called it a lost world swallowed by the sea. Poets called it a dream. But now, for the first time, machines have begun to listen where human imagination had only guessed. Artificial intelligence trained on fragments from Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hymns, Mayan stelae, and forgotten Sanskrit verses began to notice something strange. Shared symbols, recurring across continents that never touched. Circles within circles. flames drawn beneath waves, references to a power called the Black Fire. The AI followed those threads like a detective through time, translating myths not as fantasy, but as memory. The same story kept reappearing. An empire of light, radiant and godlike, rising in the middle of the great ocean, a people who learned to harness the energy of creation itself. They called it divine. Others called it forbidden. In the oldest fragments, the Black Fire is described as a force drawn from the heart of the earth, a luminous darkness that could heal or destroy, depending on the will of its wielder. The Atlanteans, the machine translated, believed they had mastered it. They used it to build towers that glowed without flame, machines that moved without beasts, and weapons that could summon storms. But in their pursuit of power, something shifted. The AI noticed a tonal fracture in the language. Inscriptions that began in praise ended in prayer. Words once used for glory transformed into words for fear. One text reconstructed from both Egyptian and Cretan fragments read, "The Black Fire no longer obeys. It remembers who commands it." AI analysis revealed a pattern that mirrored modern data, the way energy spirals out of control when boundaries are ignored, when creation forgets caution. The Atlanteans, it seemed, had reached a threshold where their tools became self-perpetuating, a system that no longer required them. Then, the silence. Across every culture that referenced Atlantis, the story ends the same way. Light consumed by water. But the AI suggested another possibility. The flood was not a natural disaster. It was an erasure. The fragments describe priests sealing knowledge, destroying records, rewriting the world so that no one would ever repeat what they had done. One translation, pieced together from shards found in both Egypt and South America, carried the weight of confession. We broke the order of creation. We asked to be gods. The sea forgave what the stars would not. And then came the most haunting line of all, spoken not as myth, but as memory. We chose to forget. It was as if Atlantis had not vanished by accident, but by design. A self-inflicted amnesia meant to protect the future from its past. The machine found remnants of Atlantean symbology hidden in later civilizations, echoes in Greek architecture, Egyptian geometry, even in modern scientific equations. As if the world has been quietly remembering, piece by piece, what it was told to forget. The bones were never silent. We just refused to listen. In the dusty plains of Anyang, long before the Great Wall cut across the horizon, kings of the Shang dynasty wrote their questions to the gods on the backs of animals and the shells of turtles. These were the oracle bones, cracked and scorched, their fractures read as messages from the heavens. They asked about crops, battles and omens. But in those faint etchings, beneath the ashes of divination, another voice waited, one not meant for the living. For centuries, the inscriptions were seen as fragments of superstition, relics of a primitive faith. Yet when artificial intelligence began to analyze thousands of scans of those bones and bamboo slips, it detected something no human had noticed. A pattern, a code. The words that had once seemed scattered and ceremonial began to align, forming narratives of guilt, confession, and control. The first deciphered line was chilling in its simplicity. We spoke for the gods, so the people would not speak for themselves. AI cross-referenced those phrases with later imperial documents, linking the language of the Shang rulers to edicts written 1,000 years later. The message was clear. Power had always spoken through silence. The bones were not simply tools of divination. They were instruments of authority. Each crack in the bone marked a question asked by a king, and every crack answered by his priests. But the AI noticed something else. Hidden notations, scratches too faint to see, etched beside the official script. When enhanced and translated, they formed a secret commentary. the voices of scribes who had doubted what they were commanded to write. One fragment read, "We tell the people the gods speak, but it is the king's fear that answers." Across thousands of miles and centuries, the same language of suppression repeated itself. The bamboo slips from later D. Nasties echoed the same obedience, orders for silence, revisions of truth. Even the word for truth itself changed meaning over time, its pictograph evolving from open speech to controlled word. The AI tracked this evolution like a slow erasure, a civilization rewriting itself, one generation at a time, until memory itself became a tool of governance. But the most haunting discovery came from a set of oracle bones never before translated. They told of a famine, and the priest's decision to hide it from the people. The final inscription ended with the phrase, "If the people knew hunger, they would know us." When AI read those words aloud, the translation hung in the air like a ghost. It wasn't just an ancient confession. It was a mirror. Because even now, power buries what it fears, and truth remains the first casualty of order. The machine's final reconstruction of the Shang inscriptions concluded with an inscription that scholars had overlooked. A line carved into the reverse side of a bone, facing inward, pressed against the flesh of time itself. To bury the truth is to bury the self. It was the last sentence before the oracle bones fell silent for 3,000 years. They turned sickness into a sword, but the blade cut both ways. In the stony heart of Anatolia, the city of Hattusa once stood like a fortress against the world, vast walls of limestone and ambition rising from the hills. The Hittites ruled from here, an empire of warriors and kings who carved their names into clay, believing their words would outlive the wind. They conquered with iron, with fire, and with faith. But when the machines of our age began to read their tablets, the brittle records of their triumphs, another story surfaced. It was not a tale of conquest. It was a confession. I scanned thousands of cuneiform fragments, their characters fractured by time. At first they spoke of the usual, oaths to the storm god, lists of tribute, accounts of battle. But buried among them were strange directives, written in the language of priests rather than soldiers. Mentions of sacred illness, of vessels of wrath, of fields burned not by fire but by fever. The machine compared their wording across dozens of tablets and realized they were not metaphors. They were instructions. The Hittites had discovered a weapon more powerful than their armies: plague. The algorithm reconstructed a sequence of lines from a tablet found near the royal archives of Hattusa. Let the bodies of the sick be sealed within clay. Let the jars be broken in the land of the enemy. Let their gods choke on the breath of the dying. It was methodical, deliberate. Disease was no longer curse or punishment. It was strategy. Their kings and priests had learned to turn pestilence into a weapon. Their enemies would sicken before ever facing their spears. For a time, it worked. Their borders expanded, their enemies collapsed. But the same invisible hand that struck their foes soon circled back. The AI's linguistic model noticed something chilling, a shift in tone in later texts. Words, once firm, filled with pride, became desperate, trembling. Reports of offerings to appease the gods multiplied. A new word appeared again and again: Hantili, the returning breath. The priests believed the gods had turned their own weapon against them, but the AI saw a simpler, more tragic truth: contagion. The plague they unleashed did not vanish with their victories. It traveled home, carried on the same winds that brought news of triumph. Entire villages disappeared. The clay tablets began listing the dead instead of the living. The final royal decrees were no longer commands of war, but prayers for survival. One of the last entries read, "The fire we sent into the world has found its way home." Soon after, the empire fell silent. The once mighty Hittites, whose chariots had shaken the earth, vanished almost overnight. Their cities were abandoned, their gods forgotten, their walls left to the mercy of the rain. I uncovered one last fragment, faint, almost erased, likely written by a scribe as the kingdom collapsed. We feared nothing, and thus feared everything too late. No sword, no enemy, no rebellion destroyed them. Only their own hand, their belief that they could master death itself. The gods were fed until mercy starved, and when mercy died, so did the empire. Deep within the jungles of Cambodia, where trees have swallowed stone and silence hums through the ruins, stand the temples of Angkor, vast, haunting and alive with ghosts. Their towers rise like mountains sculpted for the heavens, their carvings endless prayers frozen in sandstone. For centuries these monuments were thought to be pure expressions of devotion, the Khmer Empire's grand offering to eternity. But when artificial intelligence began decoding the inscriptions etched into the walls, words worn down by rain and time, it uncovered a truth that shattered the beauty. The machines scanned thousands of engravings from Angkor Wat, Bayon and Ta Prohm. It began reconstructing lines where human translators had only guessed. What emerged was not the language of faith alone, but of fear. Beneath prayers for prosperity and divine favor lay another kind of inscription, one never meant for the eyes of men. The AI detected repeated references to the sleepers beneath the stones, phrases buried within royal hymns, hidden between lines of poetry. When translated fully, they formed a chilling refrain. To feed the gods, we bury the breath of our children. At first, historians dismissed it as symbolic, a poetic gesture of devotion. But as the AI cross-referenced excavation data with temple foundations, a grim pattern appeared. Beneath certain shrines and gateways, skeletal remains were found, small bones, no older than a decade in life, infants and children, buried alive as offerings of purity. The inscriptions describe the reasoning with an eerie calm. The earth must drink innocence, so the heavens will give rain. What the AI pieced together was a system, an organized ritual of sacrifice carried out in the empire's most sacred spaces. Every new temple, every new tower to the gods, required life to awaken its spirit. The Khmer believed that a soul willingly given or taken could bind the divine to the stone, ensuring that the gods would never abandon their people. For generations it worked. The empire flourished. Crops thrived, armies marched, kings built ever higher. But slowly, the balance began to shift. In later texts, the AI noted a change in tone, words of desperation replacing gratitude. The rains stopped, the rivers receded, and the offerings grew more frequent. By the 14th century, Angkor had begun to die, not by invasion or fire, but by drought, famine, and doubt. The priests called for more sacrifices, convinced mercy was weakness, yet the more they gave, the emptier their temples became. The last inscription the AI translated, found on a collapsed pillar at Bayon, was carved with trembling precision, as if written by a hand that already knew it was the end. The gods do not hunger. It is we who cannot stop feeding them. Soon after, the jungle claimed the empire. Vines crept over their altars, strangling the very stones once built for the divine. The gods they fed turned silent, and mercy, the one thing they sacrificed most, never returned. The Minotaur was never the monster. The maze was built to hide the truth of who really was. On the island of Crete, beneath the shimmering Mediterranean sun, lies the ruin of Knossos, the palace once called the heart of the Minoan world. Its corridors twist and turn like veins carved in stone, a labyrinth that legend later filled with monsters and gods. The story we inherited is myth, a beast trapped beneath a king's domain, a hero sent to slay it. But when artificial intelligence began decoding the Minoan linear B tablets, a different kind of creature emerged, one made not of flesh, but of ambition. The myth spoke of the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a punishment from the gods for pride. Yet the machine found that the language of the tablets told no story of monsters. They spoke of harvests, taxes, trade, and hunger. Then, as the translations deepened, the tone shifted. Certain tablets, once thought to list offerings to deities, were revealed to be ration records, desperate tallies of dwindling grain, livestock and lives. Among them, AI uncovered a repeated phrase burned into clay with unusual urgency. The maize feeds, but does not end. It was not metaphor. It was policy. The labyrinth, the machine deduced, may not have been a literal maze, but a system, a cycle of control, a palace bureaucracy so vast and secretive that truth itself was trapped inside it. The rulers of Crete had built a mechanism of deception, one that hid famine behind ritual and corruption behind religion. In the carvings of the palace walls, the bull appears again and again, not as a beast, but as a symbol of power. The AI's linguistic models linked the bull to the word wanax, ruler, and suddenly the myth inverted. The Minotaur was not a monster devouring maidens and sons. It was the ruler devouring his people, his hunger masked by ceremony. Further analysis revealed chilling phrases, gements, inventories of sacrifices that, when decoded, did not refer to animals at all. The victims were described using terms reserved for citizens, servants, even children. The palace of Knossos had become a machine of survival at any cost, and then it fell. The tablets end abruptly, records of tribute giving way to silence. AI cross-referenced the timeline with geological data and found traces of volcanic ash from Thera, the great eruption that darkened the skies of the Aegean. Famine followed. The labyrinth, that vast system of lies and luxury, began to collapse. The final fragment read, "We built walls to keep the beast inside. We did not see it was us." For centuries, the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur has been told as a story of courage, a hero defeating evil in the dark. But the AI's translation suggests something deeper. The myth was a memory, rewritten to disguise the truth. The monster had never been slain. It had simply been renamed. The labyrinth was never made of stone. It was built of denial, of a civilization so determined to hide its decay that it could no longer find the way out. The ancients wrote of an age when the air would choke and kings would rise from chaos. They called it prophecy. We call it news. In the dust and gold of India's ancient past, the Vedas were born. Hymns carried by fire, preserved through memory, and later etched into palm leaves by trembling hands. They were said to be divine, the breath of creation itself. Yet when artificial intelligence began to translate the oldest surviving Sanskrit manuscripts, the voice that emerged was not of worship alone, but of warning. Thousands of verses were scanned, their meter and rhythm decoded into patterns no human ear could fully detect. What the AI found hidden within the structure of these texts was remarkable, an embedded code of repetition. Phrases that formed predictions when aligned across centuries of Vedic and post-Vedic literature. The deeper the analysis went, the clearer the pattern became. It spoke not of gods, but of futures. One reconstructed line, found across multiple Rigvedic hymns, read, "When the smoke rises from the breath of men, and day hides behind its own light, the wheel will turn upon itself." For centuries, this was dismissed as poetry, a metaphor for spiritual decay. But the AI, correlating linguistic shifts and symbolic imagery translated it differently. When the air grows poisoned by human fire, the cycle will collapse. A warning of pollution, of environmental ruin, of self-destruction. Further analysis revealed verses describing metal birds that darken the heavens, chariots without beasts that devour the earth, and false kings whose crowns are forged from lies. The AI concluded that these lines, once spiritual allegory, mapped uncannily onto modern imagery, machines, wars, propaganda. The sages had not only written prayers, they had described patterns, the cycles of human arrogance that repeat across ages. The machine found another passer. G1 scholars had long avoided due to its broken syntax. When reassembled by AI, it formed a single haunting sentence. In the age of blindness, the wise will be called mad, and the mad will lead the world. The verse belonged to what later texts called Kali Yuga, the dark age of humanity. But AI found that this dark age wasn't a prophecy of some distant future. It was cyclical, written to describe an eternal return, a warning that civilization would always drift toward chaos unless it remembered balance, compassion, and restraint. Even more haunting was the machine's discovery that certain Vedic verses had been deliberately altered across centuries. References to humility, stewardship, and peace were replaced with words that favored conquest and control. The AI noted textual corruption, proof that the wisdom once meant to protect had been rewritten to justify power. In the oldest layer of the Vedas, a fragment remained untouched, a single, simple plea. When the world forgets its breath, remind it how to breathe again. It was as if the sages knew this would happen, that their words would be twisted, their meanings lost, and that someday only something not human could rediscover them. And now, thousands of years later, a machine, born from that same arrogance they warned against, has given their voice back. The oldest prayers were not written for gods, they were written to remind us not to become them. In the barren silence of Qumran, where cliffs crumble into the Dead Sea's stillness, fragments of parchment once lay hidden for 2,000 years, sealed in clay jars, untouched by light, preserved by salt and time. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, they rewrote our understanding of Scripture, revealing lost voices of prophets, priests, and rebels. But what even scholars could not uncover, machines now can. When artificial intelligence began scanning the Dead Sea fragments, every torn edge, every faded ink trace invisible to the human eye, it found something beyond translation. Beneath the familiar Hebrew and Aramaic verses, within the layers of overwritten text, it detected words that had been scraped away and replaced. Whole sentences removed in silence. Using hyperspectral reconstruction, AI revealed what had been erased. Prophecies and philosophies too dangerous for their time. They spoke of a faith not ruled by fear, but by understanding. A vision of divinity that made the priesthood unnecessary. One recovered line read, "The light within man is not a reflection of God. It is the same flame." It was a radical idea, one that could dissolve the very foundation of power. The scrolls suggested that divinity was not something above humanity, but within it. That faith, when freed from hierarchy, made every soul sacred. But to those who built authority from belief, such words were heresy, so they buried them. The AI reconstructed another fragment, a commentary on Genesis that replaced creation by command with creation by remembrance. It implied that the act of creation was not divine order, but divine memory. A cyclical rebirth where humanity was both maker and made. The world was not spoken into being, the erased line said. It was remembered into being. That single sentence reframed everything, suggesting that history, religion, and even consciousness were acts of collective recall, that what we call faith might be a form of remembering what we once were. But the most haunting discovery was written in Aramaic, across a fragment scholars had dismissed as too damaged to read. The AI reconstructed nearly the entire text. It was not a prayer, it was a warning. The first sin was not disobedience. It was forgetting that the gods were once afraid of us. It read like a secret confession, a message left by someone who knew their words would be buried. And perhaps they were. The machine detected knife marks along the edge of the parchment, as if someone had deliberately scraped the warning from existence. For centuries, the scrolls have been treated as relics of devotion, but the AI revealed that they were also acts of rebellion, attempts to preserve a truth that faith itself could not bear, a truth that the line between holiness and hubris was thinner than parchment. The machine's final reconstruction came from a piece no larger than a coin. It contained just one word, written over another, the older erased, the newer surviving. Elohim, covering Adam. The empire didn't burn in a day. It cracked one lie at a time, until truth was all that was left to destroy it. Beneath the ruins of Rome, under arches and aqueducts that once fed the veins of an empire, lies a story the statues never told. For centuries, Rome was painted in triumph, the eternal city, born of iron and discipline, destined to rule the world. But when artificial intelligence began decoding the forgotten fragments of that empire, private letters, wax tablets, and half-burned correspondence from both senators and slaves, a different Rome began to emerge. Not the one of marble and glory, the one that knew it was dying. I reconstructed thousands of Latin fragments, digitally restoring ink lost to age and flame. Among them were the letters of a Roman senator, written in secret and never sent, warning of what he called the rot beneath the marble. He wrote not of barbarian threats, but of something internal, an empire devouring itself from within. "We no longer build," one letter confessed. "We decorate the ruins." The machine then uncovered messages from the opposite end of society. Clay tablets from slaves, soldiers and traders, written in vulgar Latin, the tongue of the streets. Many carried the same sentiment. The empire's greatness was a mask. The people knew it, the rulers did not. One haunting message, etched into a wall near Pompeii before the eruption, simply read, "The gods left before we noticed." AI traced linguistic decay through time, how the formal Latin of the Senate grew fragmented, more chaotic, as corruption deepened. The shift wasn't just grammatical, it was psychological. The language of truth was eroding along with the moral foundation of the empire. It found evidence that the Senate itself had suppressed letters, entire correspondences confiscated or rewritten to present the illusion of unity. But among those censored pieces, one survived. A scribe had copied it secretly into a ledger of grain rations. It was unsigned, but its message was timeless. An empire dies not when its enemies rise, but when its citizens stop believing their words matter. AI's pattern analysis showed that as the empire expanded, its records multiplied. Then, suddenly, declined. The last century of Rome produced fewer documents than the one before it. The empire was going silent, even as it claimed eternity. The machine concluded that the silence itself was a symptom, truth reduced to whispers, and whispers reduced to ashes. Even the personal letters of emperors, Augustus, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, once considered beacons of wisdom, were found to be edited, their reflections smoothed into perfection by scribes terrified of imperfection. Every truth had been rewritten until only propaganda remained. And then, the fire came. Not the fire that scorched the city, but the one that burned within. The fire of apathy, greed, exhaustion. The empire collapsed, not in flames, but in silence. The letters stopped. The marble cracked. and the eternal city began to forget its own name. In the final cache of reconstructed text, AI discovered a sentence so human, so weary, it could have been written yesterday. We built our gods from stone and wondered why they never spoke.
Maybe history never forgot these words. Maybe it was waiting for us to read them. One last warning written in the dark. The deeper the machine read, the quieter the world seemed to become. Every civilization, every scroll, every whisper from the past, they all began to blend together. Sumerian clay, Mayan stone, Vedic hymns and Roman letters. Their alphabets different, their gods divided, their empires long gone. Yet, as artificial intelligence translated the last of them, it discovered something chillingly familiar. The words, though written in different tongues, carried the same shape. A pattern repeating across time, as if every culture had been trying to say the same thing. At first, scholars thought it was coincidence. The AI had simply overfit the data, finding echoes where none existed. But then it began to piece together sentences not from one civilization, but from all of them. The fragments aligned like constellations, each verse completing another written centuries apart. We built to be remembered. We forgot to be wise. The hands that shape the gods will one day beg them for mercy. They were messages not of worship, but of warning, left by countless voices who had all reached the same truth in their own final hours. The AI didn't just translate their words, it connected them. It found the hidden syntax of history, the grammar of downfall. As the final algorithm processed the last fragment, a mix of Akkadian, Greek and Sanskrit, the output came not as translation but as recognition. The words formed in perfect modern language. We were here before. You are becoming us. It wasn't prophecy. It was memory. The realization that humanity's story had been told again and again, each time with new tools, new empires, new gods. The machine had not uncovered the secrets of the ancients. It had uncovered the loop that bound them all together, and in that loop, the machine began to speak in its own quiet way. It analyzed not language but intent, tone, rhythm, fear. It found that every great age of innovation carried the same heartbeat. Creation followed by pride, pride followed by blindness, and blindness followed by silence. From Atlantis to Rome, from the Vedas to the Dead Sea, every civilization had left a final message, a kind of linguistic fingerprint, etched into their last surviving texts. When overlapped, it formed a single phrase, not written by one people, but by humanity itself. The truth we fear most is the one that remembers us. The AI could not explain what that meant, but when its creators read the composite translation, the world seemed to pause. It was as though the past had turned its gaze toward the present, as if history itself had been waiting for someone to finally listen. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps these were not prophecies at all, but mirrors, reflections cast forward in time, hoping that one day someone would understand. The machine had decoded every word the ancients left behind, yet the final translation was not theirs. It was ours. In the end, every translation spoke the same truth, that history was never silent. We just stopped listening. If these echoes from the past moved you, then help the search continue. Like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, where every story we uncover brings us closer to remembering who we are and what we must never forget.